Hello and welcome. I am Kemuel Pascal and you are viewing One and One here on WESN Content Capital. Well, in today's episode we are speaking about the death penalty, and it's certainly one of the most talked about and one of the most arguable things here in Trinidad and Tobago. With many of the view that it should be brought back and some sharing the view that we should just do away with it. However, a recent Privy Council judgment back on the 16th of May 2022 has obviously given rise to debate on the issue once again. Joining us, we have Mr. Darian Narayan, Acting Chair of the Catholic Commission for Social Justice. Mr. Narayan, hello and welcome to One on One.
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me here. It's a joy to be here on One on One, man.
Thanks very much for joining us. Now, it's certainly an issue that even you and I were speaking about it. It's something that's very, very broad, a lot of legal technicalities in there that can be explored. However, I wanted to bring it up because you are aware of the recent Privy Council ruling back on the 16th of May of this year that spoke to the fact that it cannot be abolished. They cannot remove it from the country because it's a constitutional law, and it was brought into our laws based on the saving clause law back in 1976 Constitution. What do you represent, and what are your views on the death penalty?
So for us, especially when we take it from a religious perspective as well, the dignity of the human person is essential, very important. Looking and examining that, and what do I mean by that? You know, some of the basics, like every human has the right to life, etc. And people need to be mindful of that out there. So for us, we opposed the death penalty, straightforward, outrightly. Because we believe in something called restorative justice. We believe in the ability for the human to be able to develop and change. And long gone are the days where, you know, the death penalty was the ultimate answer. There are now all sorts of new modes and new ways in which we can see the rehabilitation of people who have committed serious and severe crimes.
Now, the obvious question is, you mentioned in there that there are things that you will stand for, tenets that you will stand for. What are some of those tenets outside of the basic right to human life?
Mm-hmm. So the dignity of the human person, the sanctity of life, these are things which tie into our social justice principles overall of the Catholic Church. And therefore, moving with that and having a firm understanding of that allows us to then say, okay, no, we are opposed to say, somebody being put on death row or the death penalty being administered. And I mean, a lot of nations across the globe right now have been moving away from the death penalty. We have had the abolition of the death penalty in some countries already. And as you know, even with like the EU, the European Union, they've been leading the charge on these discussions for quite some time, the abolition of the death penalty. So for us, we align with that, we align with those views. And we believe in of course, the spirit, the soul having a very important part in our human body and our physical manifestation. So with that understanding, we must move and operate in a way that sees the soul as being able to be redeemed, and the physical manifestation of the body is just a reflection of the soul itself.
Now, I'm glad you mentioned that. You made a particular point in there where you stated that many countries have gone the way of abolishing the death penalty. In fact, Trinidad and Tobago, it should be noted that Trinidad and Tobago remains the only country in the Caribbean that has the death penalty on its books in terms of by way of law still to this very date. And so when many people call on the government to re-implement or to bring back that to law, it's not that it's not in law, but it's that it's still there. However, there are a lot of technicalities with the law, as I mentioned before, in terms of actually carrying out a death sentence, in a sense. So now I want to look at the recent judgment. But before I look at the recent judgment, in 2011 there was a research paper done by Mr. Roger Hood and Florence C. Mongal, and they are from the UE Faculty of Law, and it was titled the Death Penalty Project, Public Opinion on the Mandatory Death Penalty in Trinidad. They didn't really look at Tobago. So in that section 3 of it asks the question of who supported the death penalty. And it states there were no statistically significant differences in the proportions of men, which are stating that some 27% of men at that time support the death penalty, and women some 26%, and those persons who were polled are between the ages of 18 to 44 years, and those older than 45 years are some 26%, make up some 26%. However, they did note that there was a substantial and statistically significant difference according to ethnicity. So what they are saying is essentially different ethnicities have different views on whether or not the death penalty should be carried out. Now, you obviously sit at an interesting point. You get the views of many people, though your position is that the death penalty should be abolished. What is the position that you get on the ground right now based on just the people that you speak to?
I mean, it's almost very evenly split when you talk to people on the ground. And given as well rising crime statistics that we're seeing, people are being impacted. Long gone are the days where it was a distant thing to be impacted by crime, right? Where it was a select few or a small portion of people being impacted. Now everybody's impacted and significantly impacted as well. I'm sure you yourself, you probably know somebody who has been a victim of grievous crime. I myself, I know people who have been. And because of that, there's a lot of emotional turmoil that cannot be neglected or removed from the equation and the conversation inside there that, of course, will impact people's request for justice. But I think what is happening is that we're seeing justice taking a long time to be implemented. And that's where the major problem lies. Sometimes you have people who are out on bail, you know, with grievous crimes, etc. And we've seen recent occurrences of some of these things occurring and happening. And for that, the people who are immediately affected, let's say the family members of somebody who's murdered, they are going to say, but the justice system is failing us. And you see the ideology that the justice system is failing us, or that opinion, or that reality, I can't even say it's an opinion, because in many instances and cases it is a reality. The reality that is happening makes people then say, you know, I want justice in my own hands, so that, or that when the justice comes, it must be at the highest level or the most severe level of justice, so that it can make up for the lapse of time that I had to go,
also took place.
Correct, and that I had to go through suffering and all of that. So you see people moving towards that and sort of hinting towards that, and I think that's where you get that 50%. Then there's another. I'm averaging. I'm not a statistician. I didn't go and do any research on this. It's based on the people that I've interacted with, and then the other half of people who you have conversations with tend to take it from a much more spiritual standpoint. And I'm not only talking here limited to just a Catholic perspective, but other Christian denominations, Hindus, Muslims, etc., all of them across the board. You see them having this movement towards viewing the human and the human life as having such intrinsic value and such important value that the way in which we should approach this should be totally different. You know, we've seen a lot of the Nordic countries, even like Norway, implementing restorative justice, and their systems. If you watch their criminal justice systems and the way in which they deal with people, well, they have very few people who commit grievous crimes, but the ones who have, the way how they do it is almost a reintegrative model by trying to reintegrate them into society through different means and the way in which they set up their prison systems and their justice systems, etc. So, but you have people who, bringing it back a little bit, you have people who look at this through a spiritual lens, and they believe that the person can change. They believe that the person can be altered, and that there's a much greater effect and domino effect if you get the conversion of, let's say, someone who has committed a serious and intense crime. If you have the conversion of their heart and the conversion of their spirit, for them to realize what I have done is wrong, and then for them to also speak out on the matter and make an attempt to change. It shows a higher evolution of mindset as well.
Sure. There were at least two things within there that three things rather, that I would really want to peg on at some point within the interview. However, I do want to note for the viewers that the current state of the death penalty in Trinidad and Tobago, as mentioned previously, it states, as mentioned previously, the death penalty is usually given to persons convicted of murder or treason, and once the death sentence has been read to that convict, then he or she is hanged by the state. In fact, under Section 4 of the Offences Against the Person Act, Chapter 1108, and I wish to quote, every person convicted of murder shall suffer death. Now, as you mentioned, there are many issues within the justice system. There are issues from just by way of the starting of trials, to how fast justice is dispensed, to what individual family members may feel is actually justice to them, because a sentence may be handed down for a crime, and you may not feel that that's fitting for what the crime that was committed against your family member or even yourself. And so you may think that the best way forward is the death penalty. what would you say to those persons who feel that particular way? Because obviously you do share a different view, and there are many people who would share an opposing view to you.
I think the first thing that we need to do is listen. I think we don't do enough listening at times. And for me, my position, I need to first listen to that person and what they've gone through, because it's obvious that my experience wouldn't be the same as them. So you see, it's about humanizing everything, and that experience, I cannot even begin to imagine what it's like to lose a family member through some grievous form, whether it be a serious murder, you know, for those who might be raped, etc. All of those things are serious crimes that impact people in ways that will have ripple effects, affect the people around them, and all of those things for their lives, for the rest of their lives. So the important thing is to have that conversation first. Let them express everything that they're going through. Let them fully come out and say why they want that. And once we have an understanding of the why, the reasoning behind why they want that justice, is there that we find the middle ground, and then we start to say, well, what do you think about this and this approach or that approach? Or do you think there is redemption for that person there? And I think that's important. It's important for them to know that you're listening, that you share in their pain and in their grief. But it's also important for us to see see redemption as being available for an individual who has committed a serious crime.
Let your voice be heard. Call Madam Fix It on WESN, the only place that effectively helps you with your woes. Having problems getting onto government agencies, water woes, NIS and pension problems, potholes, and much, much more. Call me, Madam Fix It, every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, right here on WESN. Let me fix it for you.
Just based on the paper that I would have cited earlier, when we look at part 4 of that, it says, why was the death penalty supported in Trinidad and Tobago? And I wish to quote, those who favor the mandatory death penalty were shown a list of possible reasons why they might do so, and asked to rank them by way of most favored and least supported. And a very large majority chose as their first reason one of the phrases denoting retribution. 229 of the 264 supporters of the mandatory death penalty, which is some 87%, emphasizing equal treatment for all who murder and thus deserve death, including giving satisfaction to their relatives. Flatly on the point, or squarely on the point that I would have raised before, which is that people actually want to see that the crime that was committed against their family member or even themselves, the level of justice is meted out to them, is met to them. So how do you then respond to that person? Because obviously, yes, you can have conversations and you can give them or show them different options. But if it's that they are so set in their way that they think that this is the best thing that would actually give them some level of vengeance, then obviously you're not going to get that change. And hence we are at this position right now in our history that we still have the death penalty on our books.
And I think this is where as well the importance of the justice system comes into play, because there is a heavy emotional component to a study such as that. I mean, if somebody has just lost a loved one, I don't know if you've ever lost a loved one or somebody close to you, but when in those few months or even that period of time, nobody knows how long, it varies in time to recover from something like that for different people, right? In that period of time, you're in a high level of emotions and emotional turmoil, and therefore your decision-making process might not be as sound or as even or as fair as, say, if you weren't in a state of emotional distress. And I mean, if we watch the psychology behind all of that, we know that people make rash decisions in a period of emotion, in an emotional state or a period of emotional distress. So therefore, that is why we need a strong system of justice itself, but also a fair system of justice. And hopefully, the revisions that we see entering into the legal aspect as well could sort of reflect that in a very meaningful way. I think what is when you look at that and what is happening is that a lot of people, as I mentioned earlier, they just feel as if the tit for tat, the Old Testament, you know, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, you know, that old saying, they still live by that. And there's a pop cultural phenomena or issue that's arising as well that ties into that. I mean, pop culture affects our general dispositions, whether people choose to accept it or not. But what we view on television, what we look at in our popular media, and that is a sort of a recurring theme or ideology that you see repeated in a lot of movies, in a lot of shows, etc. And it does not go in depth. There's no in-depth investigation of the impact of different behaviors and the impact of, let's say, murdering somebody in retribution, right? And how that impacts wider populations or people who view that or people who see that. They're not in-depth studies or enough in-depth studies around that. We just see it as a tit for a tat and a eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, and that it needs to be immediate. We need to do this. We need to take it into our own hands. And everything that we do and every action that we take has a consequence, and we need to be very mindful of that as well.
Sure, and I'm glad you mentioned retribution, because that's exactly what I was about to ask you next, what I am about to ask you next, rather. And of course, those viewing at home will be saying, okay, you are advocating against the death penalty, but however, it may serve as what they see as a deterrent. But you mentioned that there are no scientific studies that necessarily says that it's actually a deterrent. You're going to make a point?
No, I was going to say, not that I'm saying that they're not, I'm saying that they aren't enough.
They aren't enough,
yeah,
understood.
Yeah.
So, because in part 5 of this particular report that I examined, it states, it asks rather, how strong was retributive as compared with deterrent support for the mandatory death penalty? Our respondents were asked whether their support would still be strong for the death penalty, or whether mandatory or discretionary, if new scientific evidence proved that the death penalty was not a better deterrent than a long imprisonment. Of those who favored the mandatory death penalty, 80% said their support would still be as strong as a further 7%, and as a further 7% said that it would remain somewhat strong. So it's a 87% altogether. So there are obviously the people who are sitting at home watching us right now, and they are saying, here's what, I agree with everything you're saying, you know. I agree that we can go to a form of restorative justice and all that. But what happened to me? What happens to my future generations? Wouldn't the death penalty serve better as a deterrent to crime?
So, in the few studies that I have engaged with, what we see is that the death penalty does not really necessarily serve as a deterrent to crime. In fact, in some instances, what we have seen is, and of course they're both sides of the argument, right? There are studies on both ends of the spectrum. But what you've seen is that violent behavior sort of breeds violent behavior. You know, if you recount the last time that the death penalty was executed, and there was a public execution in Trinidad and Tobago, I don't know if you ever had the chance to have conversations with anybody who was there, but the way in which they reacted to that and spoke about that moment, it wasn't as if they felt a sense of relief in that moment. There was almost a sense of emptiness or hollowness after the execution was done. And for children watching on at that sort of breeds, again, you know, a more violent mindset, that violence is the answer in any case of crime or in any case of somebody doing me something wrong. And I think we have to be very cautious with that line, because when you start to tether that line, you could go either way, you know.
Certainly. Now, obviously, in this whole aspect, the justice system does play a big part, because they are the ones that have to dispense justice. And there is, of course, that level of in support of your argument, rather, there's that level of innocence that someone can be killed essentially and given the death penalty just because of the fact, and they may actually be innocent. So, in a sense, what I want to get to is that. And this particular report states innocence and its impact on the level of support for the death penalty. And it asks, to what extent was support for the death penalty contingent on its use only for those persons who are truly and without question guilty of the crime for which they have been convicted? And there is, of course, that factor. We cannot take that away from the equation at all. There is the factor that a person can be innocent and end up on the death penalty and eventually be killed, and then there's what justice is there for the family. On one end, people may be celebrating, but then when they actually hear that this person was actually innocent, that changes the entire equation. So there are people who would agree with that. What are your views on that particular point?
I mean, it's self-explanatory, you know. If somebody ends up being killed on death row and they are innocent, the fallout from something like that on the wider population, but also on the people who might have been calling for that level of justice, you know, it doesn't solve anything, it doesn't resolve anything. In fact, it creates more tension, more issues, more problems overall. Because if that person is truly innocent in the instance where they might be killed on death row or on death penalty, then their family then become victims as well, you know, of this. And then you can have ripple effects. There's a call for retribution on both sides, you know. They want justice here for their family member who was killed innocently, and then that could lead to all sorts of issues, further problems, and a further downward spiral.
Certainly. Now, in the position that you sit, obviously you are advocating against the death penalty. What is your level of collaboration and stakeholders that you speak to in terms of actually ensuring that this happens? Because the Privy Council has essentially given the ruling. They are our final court of appeal, and they have stated that they can't do it. It's up to the government. What are some of your conversations like with people within your network in terms of ensuring that this is done? Because I know this has been a cause that has been championed over the years by many persons, even persons who came before you.
Yes, correct. So, I mean, Leela Ramdeen, who would have been the chair of the CCSJ prior to me, she would have been advocating for this for decades, you know, not even years, decades. Her life has been dedicated to this, and she still sits on the Greater Caribbean for Life, which our organization, CCSJ, sits on, which collaborates with organizations across the entire Caribbean who are pushing, across the entire Eastern Caribbean, who are pushing for the abolition of the death penalty. We've also done collaborations with the EU, moving for this and advocating for this and pushing for this as well, the abolition of the death penalty. But again, it lays in the hands of our lawmakers and our legal minds out there, and I'm hoping that we have some strong innovators who can really push for it to make the difference, to make the abolition happen. But I also want people to be very clear on why we're pushing for this, why we're doing what we're doing, and why we should come to the decision to abolish the death penalty. You know, I mean, just the thing is as well is that it has not been practiced for the last how many other decades. It has not been practiced. We have not been publicly executing people, even though we may have people on death row. And that's because it's not best international practice as well. There could be sanctions against us trade-wise and all of that for something like that to happen. So we have to ask our questions, why are people pushing so much for the abolition of the death penalty as well? And that's because we are seeing new systems of justice that are emerging. We're seeing studies that have proven that the death penalty is not necessarily a deterrent to crime, to violence. We're seeing different things that are emerging over and over and over. And therefore, we have to take all those things in account when we make our final decision, and when the lawmakers, which I pray to God, really make the right decision going forward.
Well, I know you've clearly stated that it is in their power to do it. You don't necessarily have the power to do it, but you have the power to advocate. Do you get a sense that we can see this soon, or is it that it's not something that's up for high consideration. I mean, you don't sit in the cabinet, but obviously, just based on the people that you speak to on your network, you probably may get a sense of whether or not what you all are doing and what you all are advocating for is actually bearing some amount of fruit.
Yeah, I think that we need a revision of our constitution overall as well, in many other areas, not just with this matter of the death penalty. I mean, the saving clauses alone, looking and re-examining that, but that's a whole other conversation all by itself, and the depth of conversation that needs to happen around that. I think that this is one that is a pressing issue as well. It's a issue that is coming up. I mean, it just came up recently this year, and we see it coming up and popping up over and over and over. And it'll be nice to probably have the advocacy move towards the abolition of it, and probably looking at the revision of all our laws and our constitution overall as well. I mean, when you watch our constitution and you open it up, it states, of course, an adherence to God, etc. Like the first page or something, the first 2 pages, it says something about that, you know. So making sure that we keep that in mind as well, that aspect.
But do you think there's enough advocacy or enough education, enough awareness to not just people within your network, but people outside of the network? Because as I was mentioning to you before, outside of that ruling in May, we weren't really hearing anything about it, save and except for a couple of years ago when it was explored by way of the former Attorney General, Faris Al-Rawi, speaking to a former Attorney General in that of Ramesh Lawrence Miraj, to get it in terms of how we get going with it again. Do you think that enough is being done?
No, I think that there's much more that we can do, but you just read out the statistics to me and you're saying that 87% or something of the people who were interviewed in this case, you know, still had a strong affiliation to it. So then how do we have a change of heart, a change of mind, you know? And I think that we have to look at all other parts of the criminal justice system as well, make sure that our justice systems are in fact just, you know, are in fact fair. A movement towards that could then help us to move towards further advocacy for all these other areas. I think that there is a revisitation that needs to take place of all aspects of our criminal justice system, and making sure that is even, that is fair across the board, and that the execution of justice is proper. And I think that then that could help a lot with the advocacy for all the other areas that we hope to change, and everything that we hope to push for and accomplish.
Not just that, but also restorative justice, as you mentioned, and so we're hoping that some headway can be made in relation to that. But we have come to the end of this interview, and Darren, thank you so very much for joining us here on One and One. Well, this has been another episode of One and One. Thank you so very much for joining us. I am Kemuel Pascal.
WESN